recording this on January 19th, 2025. Welcome to the New Possibilities Hour, part of the Will Work for Food project, founded by Natalie Armstrong-Motan. Every week, Jean Lawler and I are delighted to host another cutting-edge webinar for lawyers, arbitrators, mediators, and everyone who negotiates. As you know, there's no charge for these great programs. Rather, we ask you to contribute to a food bank if you like what you see. And in the 4.5 years we've been running these webinars, our audiences have been so generous in contributing in honor of our great speakers. One of my favorite parts of the webinar every week is when we announce the running total of just how much people have contributed since the series began. Natalie, would you please do the honors?
Oh, Jeff, it's my pleasure. Thanks again for being such a great moderator for all these years. To date, we have been told about $680,173.63 in donations to food banks around the world. At the moment, of course, as we film, the fires that have raged through Los Angeles have created an unprecedented need in that region. We're hoping that if you're able, you can contribute any amount, even $1 helps, to the Los Angeles Regional Food Bank or Jewish Family Services in that area, and help out our folks in need.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Today we have a spectacular guest, Professor Saul Perlmutter from the University of California at Berkeley. Saul is the author, along with John Campbell and Robert McCune, of Third Millennium Thinking, Creating Sense in a World of Nonsense, bringing scientific thinking to people who are not necessarily scientists. What are Professor Perlmutter's qualifications? Well, let me read to you here. Saul Perlmutter is a 2011 Nobel laureate. Wow. Sharing the prize in physics for the discovery of the accelerating expansion of the universe. He is a professor of physics at the University of California, Berkeley, and a senior scientist at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. Professor Perlmutter, please tell us a little bit about the food bank in your area to which you'd like people to contribute if they're in a position to do so. And then on with the presentation on scientific thinking for lawyers, mediators, and negotiators. The floor is yours.
Well, hello, and nice to be here. I guess the food bank that I was particularly noticing was the one at the University of California, Berkeley. Actually, it's called the Berkeley Food Pantry, and I think it was pretty important because Berkeley is one of the premier universities in the world, but it also has the distinction of having one of the largest first generation to college student populations. And that means that students come from, are basically doing the social mobility from families where they don't have a lot of resources in many cases. And I believe the percentage is something like 40% almost of the students have suffered some food insecurity along the way. And so I think this is a very valuable resource.
Excellent. And we will post the link to that in the chat function. Now, please help us be better, more logical thinkers, scientific thinking, please.
Well, maybe it'd be interesting to tell the background of how this particular book and study started. I guess there was must have been over a decade ago. I was remembering noticing that our society has a very difficult time making what seem like just simple logical decisions. I mean, you might think that something like what is the right level to set the debt ceiling for a society is just a practical question where you just have to find out, well, what works, what doesn't work. But of course, the way that discussion runs looks a little bit more like a religious debate of some sort. And I remember thinking at the time about this as I was overhearing conversations in the cafeteria at the National Lab that I work at, and realizing that the scientists over lunch are discussing all sorts of practical decisions and policy issues in our world and in their own lives, but they were using a whole language of ideas that I think are not shared by most people in our society, and not even most parts of the university. And I was trying to think, well, where are these ideas taught? Why, where do all these scientists come across them? And it's not taught, as far as I know, in any physics, biology, chemistry course at first glance. And so I was interested in the question of, could we articulate what these ideas are and then develop a way to teach them to not just scientists at much younger stages, but also to people who are not going to go into the sciences. I think they often are, ordinarily developed by apprenticeship, that people, as they go through graduate school and postdocs and young faculty, they learn it from their advisors and their peers. But there's no reason they couldn't be defined and articulated and then developed as something that could be taught. In the end, I realized that it wasn't good enough coming to it just as a physicist, that there was many parts of the story that were not coming from that area. And so I brought in a social psychologist, Rob McCoon, could bring in who worked in the public policy school and the law school, and John Campbell, who's a philosopher. And the three of us started developing the ideas. I think, in fact, we ended up putting a little note up to see who would like to think through what the course should teach. And it said something like, are you embarrassed watching our society make decisions? Come help invent a course, come help save the world. And I believe something like, 25, 30 graduate students, postdocs, some undergraduates started showing up every week at the end of the week on a Friday, and we would go through the ideas of what would make a good set of sort of a vocabulary of ideas that would help people think through problems, not just individually, but think through problems when they work with other people. And I think that was really one of the insights of the course. So that turned into something that we've now taught for 10 years or so, and then we turned it into this book so that it was possible to distribute to people who were not going to be at Berkeley taking the course.
So how can we be better at decision making? What are the most fundamental, rudimentary things that of which we're not aware that we should be aware?
Well, we ended up sort of identifying, probably something like 23 concepts that would be helpful. But to give you a feel for the flavor of them, first of all, there's a through line that runs through a lot of it, which is that a lot of what scientific thinking developed over centuries, but especially in the last century as well, and even in recent decades, there's still ideas that have been developed. A lot of it is aimed at helping us avoid fooling ourselves. That we tend to think we understand something at first glance, and then maybe fall in love with our own theories, and we need all sorts of ways to catch our own error. And so much of this has to do with avoiding falling into mental traps. There's the issues of thinking that you see a pattern out in the world and you're sure that you know what it is, but not realizing, for example, that there's a very common mental trap that random events, random noise mimics patterns very, very easily. And most of us have no sense of how often things that look like patterns are just random noise. And so that's an example of something that it's important to have in mind, so that you know when you might need statistics to tell whether or not it's really likely to be a pattern or more likely to be random. We have a tendency to think in binaries, in black and white. So we often will think that something is either true, we know it's true, or we know it's not true. But in fact, probably most science has built around the idea eventually that we know things probabilistically, that some things we're very confident of, maybe 99.999% sure that they're true, and you'll bet your life on it. You'll get on an airplane and assume that these many tons of metal will fly. But many other things that you might think if you really think about it, you realize that, well, I'm probably only 75, 80% likely to be right in this one. And that distinction is really important because it means that you can use partial information, and it's actually most of what we have available to us is that kind of probabilistic information, and you can use it well, and you don't get stuck in this black and white thinking that, well, if I'm not absolutely positive about it, then I can't use it at all. Or if I have some doubts, then it must be wrong. And those things are actually quite useful tools to develop. Then there are all other categories of topics that we discuss, and I'll just jump to some of the later ones because they are I think perhaps particularly of interest to the audience here as well. once you learn a lot of these elements of logical, critical thinking that are in this scientific thinking, and you are beginning to try to be very rational in how you approach the problem, there's a danger that when you try to make a decision, either by yourself or with other people, that you need a good way to bring together all these rational elements with the fears and goals and values that are involved in a decision. And if you don't come up with a principled way to combine them, then there's the obvious tendency is that we tend to throw out the rationality, not the values and goals and fears, because the values and goals and fears and ambitions, those are the things that actually drive us to make a decision. And so you can't throw those out. But you can develop a way to principled ways to balance and bring together the rational elements that help you figure out what the world will do when you make a decision, and what the odds are that it will do this or it'll do that, together with what you would like the results to be. And I think that's actually a very important thing for groups to develop. When we teach and we discuss in the book different ways that people have developed that would help keep track of what do we think is likely to be real about the world, while we're trying to develop our positions and our policies and decisions. This is clearly something that I think our political worlds have not been as good at lately. That it seems that we've often let the fears and goals and values override and take over the discussion without keeping track of, yes, but what does the world really consist of, and how will it really respond to these different these policies, with an understanding that these are going to be probabilistic, and you'll need a way to keep monitoring and telling whether or not you're getting the result you want or not.
Well, can you put some flesh on the bones and talk to us more about the way that the empirical data interact with our values, our fears, and our goals? Can you give an example?
Well, I think some great examples were brought, I think, forced to all of our consciousnesses during the pandemic. Question of, practical questions like, is a lockdown actually important? Is it going to save lives? Is mask wearing going to save lives? Will vaccines save lives? These are just factual questions. The world is either this way or it's that way. It doesn't depend what we would like it to be. It's those are going to do their thing. Now, it doesn't. The fact that these are crucial, important questions doesn't mean that we get to know absolutely, with 100% confidence, yes or no. What we tend to know is something probabilistic. We have, maybe 90% confidence that a mask wearing is making a difference. Maybe we're, for vaccines, we actually have statistics there. We can be 99.99% confident. So those are different, there are differences in that. In the end, deciding what to do about that isn't just a factual question. There's a values question involved. So for example, we had to decide, how much are we going to prioritize protecting the elderly, who were very vulnerable to in the pandemic? If you lock down and everybody wears masks, and people are isolated, then it's likely that many elderly people will not catch the pandemic, and many more people won't die. On the other hand, you're trading that off against the value of children are going to become isolated and will have mental health and educational problems just because they won't have a chance to be out and in school. That is a values question. That's not a factual question. Probabilistically what the odds are that these things will be good or bad. You have to update those odds. One of the things we emphasize in the book is that you need to be thinking iteratively, not one time. But in the end, that's something that people have to make that trade-off. And I think that one thing we didn't get to capture in the last round, in the pandemic, is we didn't come up with a principled ways to make that trade-off. And so we were reduced to some policymaker had to decide, in some small group, what do we think the right answer is, and then tell everybody that's the answer. But I think it would have been much more valuable if people have had a chance to use, for example, the techniques like civic assemblies and deliberative polling, if they had been set up and well running so that you knew how to use them quickly. And you could have used it several times. People could have asked, for a given population, which thing do we want to prioritize? And maybe different communities might have chosen slightly differently on that. And I think there would be a real advantage to that, because people, when they have a chance to think about a problem together, they don't just polarize and go to extreme positions that they yell at each other with, but instead they tend to say, okay, what do we think for our group the right choice is? And then they actually look to mitigate the problems that the choice creates. So once you've invested in making a decision that, for example, you will have a lockdown, then people will feel that they ought to really dive in and help each other, make sure the children are getting enough contact and education and not be isolated. Or conversely, if you decide to prioritize the children, then people, I think, would have gone out of their way to be that much more careful with the elderly, and really test themselves before they would come across a retirement community or wear masks. And I think that was missing. I think that was a good example.
So Saul, let's take it down to the level at which our audience may deal with these things on a day-to-day basis. And that is litigated claims. Could be a breach of contract. It could be anything from an intersection collision to a huge bet the company antitrust case involving Fortune 500 companies. We deal with the issue of uncertainty in ways that could probably stand some improvement. So when we as mediators ask lawyers, how do you assess your chances in this case or the strength of the case? We sometimes get, oh, this is a lead pipe cinch. You can take this one to the bank. We get statements like that. And then sometimes we get super specific statements like, this case has I give it about a 78% chance of winning. And neither of those is particularly useful. One is too general, one is too specific. And it also doesn't really address the question for a client who's got to make a decision. Well, let's say 65% chance of winning. Do I want to cash in my chips, or do I want to play that? Although, is that good or bad to have a 65% chance of winning? It's sort of an individual question. So let's say that you're talking to a lawyer friend, and the lawyer friend tells you, oh, the other side, they don't have a ghost of a chance. We've got a lead pipe cinch. You're sitting there thinking to yourself, this is not going to be very helpful to a client. What sort of conversation might you have with that lawyer to get that lawyer to engage in more scientific or systematic thinking about their situation?
Well, of course, it depends a little bit on what the expertise is that we're talking about. But what's interesting is that when people have done studies of how well calibrated different experts are when they give confidence levels, percentages, they see very big differences among in different professions. And in particular, if you're some of the best ones are like weather predictions, where because the experts in weather get a lot of feedback. They're every day they immediately get to see whether or not their percent odds that it's going to rain actually worked. They get to calibrate that, and so the best of the weather predictions are actually quite good. When they give you 75%, that means that really 75% of the time what they're predicting will happen. But conversely, apparently experts like doctors who are very experienced people in their professions, their percentages apparently are not as reliable, and it's probably a mixture of a number of different things that will distort it. They don't get immediate feedback. It's not clear what it is that they're predicting, whether or not they're predicting the person will generally get better, or is it going to be a complete cure, or is that they're not going to do well. And so the numbers are often not very strong. And of course, I'm sure that's the case in different professions of different parts of the legal world, particularly because there's you need a tradition of actually keeping track of the batting average and the statistics. If you're really going to be using these numbers in a way that corresponds to what they mean, and so and my understanding is that generally that's not become yet a tradition. And once more, it's in the legal areas, it's probably less clear whether your bet is on a very specific outcome or a family of outcomes that could be, shaded to mean what I guess I won, or I guess I got what I was roughly after, I mean, especially I guess in a negotiation, setting. So I think those are relevant to this. And then the question is, what does a client, do about that? I guess they need to be on their guard that these odds are not as well established as it might sound, so that they have a little less confidence maybe in these particular numbers that they're being given. I think the other element of this story is one of the better indicators of somebody who you trust is that they're aware of the problem. So in this case, somebody who says, we haven't done the statistics, so we don't really know. We think that this is a stronger case, as opposed to this, and this one's very likely to win. But we haven't looked to see when I've said that before. How often is that true? And I think that would actually help provide some confidence in the person. That the person is being honest and saying what they know and what they don't know. If they can do the odds, that's even better. The other element of this, I think that's actually interesting from that I imagine comes up in at least some of these cases, is the use of expert witnesses. And that because once more, it's important for the lawyer to understand how well calibrated the field is that they're talking to. And the different expert witnesses come from fields that can give better indicator of, did they really know what they mean when they say they're 98% confidence in this, or they're only 75% confident in that. It's good to watch your experts to see what is their basis for their statements. Finally, one of the topics that we discussed in the book with respect to experts of this sort is this problem of, you want experts who will show you the weaknesses of their position, and are able to show where they could be wrong, because otherwise there's a tendency that experts will talk themselves in to thinking that they know the answer. There's a classic, these classic stories of the extent to which experts are allowed to see all the other evidence before they speak in their area. So I gather there's been whole problems with fingerprint evidence, where the tradition of fingerprint expertise there was that they would always want to speak last after all the rest of the evidence was available to them. And of course, that's the exact opposite of how scientists try to avoid falling into this trap of confirmation bias, of finding results that are what you expect to get. And in the sciences, we've moved towards hiding from ourselves all the consequences of our analyses until we've actually debugged them and checked them in every possible way, so that when we reveal them and see what the answer is, if I find the answer surprising, we've already checked, could it be wrong in this way or could it be wrong in that way? Since otherwise there's a tendency to only check for mistakes when you get an answer you don't want, or when you don't expect. And so this is something else that we think expertise in the legal world really should be adopting.
So Saul, you use the words confidence level, probabilistic thinking in ways I know from reading the book that have clear definitions and mean things that may be different from the way people commonly use these terms in conversation. Could we go back to some of these first principles, and could you teach us a little bit about how you use these terms so that we can use them more scientifically and more helpfully in our own work?
Yes. Now you're saying that, I'm realizing that we may have jumped over the stage setting of what do we mean by the terms, and started using them in my last discussion.
Yeah, well, I've already read the book, but many people who will be watching this have not.
No, exactly. So I apologize to those who've been watching it. Let's step back and discuss a little bit more what we mean here. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we live in a world where very few things are told to us with absolute certainty. That we learn things by experience, by testing things, by doing experiments. We learn things actually by finding out what other people did and hearing about their results. And we have to build up some sense of how likely something is to be true. And that's something that we, in ordinary speech, we use words to indicate. We say, this is possible, this is likely, this is pretty sure, this is, absolutely, absolutely confident that this is right. We use that kind of terminology, but in the sciences and actually in our lives in general, it's often useful to do better than just these rough categories. And because you can actually use numbers, and we're used to them in certain very specific contexts. Like, as I said, you will see a weather forecast that will tell you there's 90% chance of rain today, and another one will tell you there's only a 45% chance or a 60% chance of rain. And so we roughly might recognize what that means, but the way that you actually build up these numbers is you say the predictions are done over and over and over again over, let's say, every day if you're a weather forecaster, and you see whether or not 75% of the time when you say it's going to rain, does it really rain? And that's what you want the number to mean. 90% of the time when you say it's going to rain, when you said 90%, that's what you want to happen. And you can do that in areas where you get lots of information, where you get many, many chances at it, and you can just run the numbers and see, okay, so when I feel this confident, that's 60%. And when I have data telling me that's that confident, that's 80%. And then you can actually do that. But most of the time we don't get something quite so clear. And so we have to be gauging roughly. What we find is that you can do studies of what does it feel like to be, if I asked you, which is longer, the Amazon or the Nile, and you'd say an answer, and you'd say, but I don't know, I'm probably only 60% likely to be right, or maybe 50% likely to be right if I really don't know. Whereas if I, asked you, which is taller, the Eiffel Tower or the Empire State Building, you might give a number, you might give an answer that you say, I'm more like 80% likely to be right. And it turns out that people tend to have some sense of this. They're not usually perfect at it, and in fact, they tend to underestimate how much they know when it's really marginal, when like 50% odds that they're right, and they overestimate how much they know at the top end. That they'll say this thing I'm 99% sure of, and they will only be right maybe 88% of the time, something like that. So these things are things that people can learn over time to gauge, how is it that we're pulling in information, and it's useful. And so having that rough sense of how strongly you trust something, and maybe using it more in your daily, discussions can be helpful. A game that we played in the classroom is that we have the students discuss some practical question, like, we said, okay, has standardized testings in the school improved or hurt education? And they started a discussion of that kind. But what we throw in is we say every time you say a sentence which could be true or false, give a number for whether you think how strongly you believe it. Well, teachers are nowadays teaching to the test rather than teaching what they think is important. 78. I think that's 78% likely to be true. They find that when you do that, you become much more aware of the fact that you're resting your arguments on some things that you're very sure about, but some things that you don't really have that much confidence in. Just that practice mentally helps you be a little bit more able to think through, well, what if the 25% of the probability that I think is probably not the case, what if that was true? How would that change everything I do in this and the rest of the argument? Doing that, I think, provides a much more capability of thinking through problems, and it makes it easier to think through problems with other people, where you realize that actually we don't disagree with things as much as you think. One of you is putting something with a little bit stronger weight, and the other's a little less weight, and therefore they want to explore the problem in a slightly different way.
So this issue, Saul, of dealing with people who are overconfident is something that's very germane to us as lawyers and mediators, wanting clients to make good decisions. How do you tell us again, what are the circumstances where people tend to be most overconfident in their estimations?
Well, there's two different parts of the story that come to mind immediately, but maybe the most important is that among the cognitive biases that we discuss in the book, I think some of your audience will have read things like Danny Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, where people have gotten used to a number of the sort of odd ways that our brains tend to, and usefully come to fast conclusions. But these fast conclusions in certain areas really can lead you far astray. One of the ways that we tend to go wrong is we tend to look for evidence that will back up what we think is true, rather than looking for evidence that might disprove what we think is true. And so there's this bias towards noticing every newspaper article that agrees with what you think, rather than the newspaper articles that disagree. And there's also a bias towards being much more critical of the ways in which the article could be making mistakes and noticing the problems with it when it disagrees with the position you think you have, than an article that would agree with what you think you have. So that tends to make people much too confident in their positions of that sort. And so the need to watch out for that desire to immediately go for things that will show you right, as opposed to hunting for things that could be showing you where your thinking is weak, is a really important part of the story.
So let's say hypothetically you're advising someone. It could be in a lawyer-client relationship, or it could be with a spouse, or it could be anybody. And you think to yourself, this person is just way overconfident, right? Clients in lawsuits all the time will say, I didn't do anything wrong. Doesn't matter whether you're the plaintiff or the defendant. Nobody ever did anything wrong if you ask them. And yet lawyers are trying to get through to those clients that you're overconfident here. What are some practical approaches that you take, or that one might take, when you're dealing with someone who, let's say you have a simple lawsuit where someone claims a driver was negligent and caused an accident, and the driver claims no negligence, it was just just circumstances, or whatever. But in either case, you think both people are overconfident. How might you approach either one of those situations?
So this is interesting, right? Because these situations are ones where you're working against the grain already, right? In the sense that we have the advantage when we're teaching a course like this, that people have not, they're much earlier in the process, right? They haven't yet locked in to a particular problem at that particular time, where they have a lot invested in not being wrong. In general, what we try to do is get people to recognize all the ways that we tend to make mistakes, and that the fact that we're making mistakes all the time, that's actually built in to, for example, the whole scientific process is built around the idea that we will all be making mistakes, and that what we're doing is we're working with a community of people who will help catch each other making mistakes, and that's how we do better. These situations you're describing, the hard part would be, I think, to step back first before one even starts discussing the particular case, and discuss the more general human condition, that we are, fallible thinking machines, and we will tend to be misunderstanding things, and thinking that we are sure about something that we shouldn't be, and that a lot of the reason that we want to work with other people is that we need other people to help us catch the places that we could be going wrong this time. I mean, in this particular case, that's uphill work, I'm sure, for people who have a lot invested in not believing that. But maybe that's the starting point, doing that before you even begin discussing the particulars of the case at all, and say, that this is something that we all do, and that that we will ourselves have made those mistakes, and describe things that we've misunderstood, and the ways in which you need other people to help you to help capture that. And that's actually one of the strengths of how science works. This isn't a big failure mode. This is how we've done very well. And then maybe we can possibly get somebody to think, okay, maybe it's possible that I'm only seeing the things that I want to see in this particular case, because that's how humans tend to work, and that they probably need somebody else to help them think through, okay, where could this be wrong, so that they can have more realistic assessment of the situation, which they might be forced to deal with when they go into a law case. That in the end of the day, you probably want to know something about the likelihoods of the truth, because they will probably affect how the outcome comes out.
So you got to help us here, because this is the biggest problem. This is the biggest problem I think that lawyers face. Somebody feels they have been wronged, so badly wronged, that they work up the gumption and they go to a lawyer, and they're in the throes of anger. They've actually had to overcome their dislike of lawyers and actually go talk to a lawyer. And they're looking for the lawyer to be their champion.
Yeah.
On the other side of the aisle, we have somebody who's been sued and can't believe that this plaintiff has had the audacity to sue them when they're very reasonable, righteous people and have done nothing wrong.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they go to a lawyer, defend me, I've done nothing wrong.
Yeah.
So the lawyer is in a bind. The lawyer is concerned that if the lawyer does not project some gladiator champion mentality, this client, this piece of business, this opportunity to earn a living as a lawyer, is going to go down the street to another lawyer who will, who will do some chest thumping. So the lawyers do not really want to engender unrealistic expectations on the part of clients, but they're concerned that if they don't thump their chest a little and promise they're going to, bring home the rewards, that the client will go elsewhere. Are there some techniques that, in your experience, are more diplomatic or more effective in dealing with folks in that sort of situation?
I mean, the analogous example that we discussed in the book a little bit, is the fact that a politician who's trying to get elected, you can imagine that it's much, at least in our current world, it's much easier to go out and say, I know it's right for this city that we're going to do this and it's going to work, as opposed to the politician who will say, there are many. This is a complicated question. We have a policy plan here that's, we think, is 75% likely to work. And if it doesn't work, we have fallback plans that we will move to. And people, we think, today would tend to gravitate to the person who tells you it's 100% likely to work. And so it's a very similar problem, that you're basically selling a projection of false confidence. The hard part is that what will work in the long run, right, is a little different than what is likely to work in the immediate. If a lawyer, presumably builds up a reputation for being the reasonable person that you go to, and they will not sell you something that isn't realistic, then presumably, clients, I can imagine clients that have a long-term iterative intent to work with a lawyer will get it. Eventually they will say, that one over there is flashy, always sounds good, but this one over there, when they say something, I really listen, because it makes it comes out better. And I imagine, corporations that will hire a lawyer or a firm, over and over again for many, many cases, that would be an easier story to tell. And of course, there you really want to take the trouble to, if possible, capture and quantify, where the probabilities are and why it is that this more thoughtful approach is really what the client wants at the end of the day. Having done that, of course, it's possible that a one-time client could be told that story, right? So a one-time client who's not a corporation who will do this over and over again, who is in much more danger of being caught by the flashy style of somebody who's absolutely positive they can do it, and that the person's everything the person says must be right. Presumably, the best one can do as the more responsible style is to say, well, here's why we approach it this way. And, I could tell you that, I'm going to fight for everything you say because it's absolutely right. Or I can say, I will, what we're going to try to do is the best we're going to get in this situation where there's another side that is going to claim that they're all right. And we've got to find a way to be able to capture what we think the realism is going to be, because that's where the answer is going to come out when there's a judgment, or a negotiated settlement. And so that's, why we think you want to come to us as this more realistic partner. Know that these issues of this problem is not an easy one to solve, and we certainly have not solved it for how politicians can tell their story yet. And so this is a big deal. But I think that would be the starting approach that I would take. And once more, I would try to separate out for people a little bit the questions of what is the world going to do, because it's the world is going to do its thing no matter what we want it to do, from what things do we feel like the world should do, because that's the world we want to live in.
So now first of all, it's quite comforting to know that even a Nobel Prize winner finds the problem hard, because we find it hard. So now let's roll the tape forward a little, Saul. And we are often in the situation in a mediation where a lawyer comes to us as the neutral mediator and says, Jeff, you got to help me here. Natalie, you got to help me here. My client has unrealistic expectations. I've been trying to tell my client that, our chances of winning are not as high as the client thinks they are. The client perhaps is driven by emotion, oftentimes driven by emotion, much more than the lawyer, whose job it is to take a more cool, calm, and collected look at things. And the lawyer comes to the mediator and says, I'm coming to the mediation for help in trying to get these unrealistic expectations down to planet Earth. Since you're a cosmologist, I think that'll ring a bell with you. And out of the high heavens and down to planet Earth, what are some things that we can do to try to help that lawyer get the client's expectations out of the clouds?
Well, my memory of some of the techniques of mediation are actually very germane here, right? That in some sense, you can teach me, as much as I can teach you, in the sense that my memory is that there are these techniques that involve trying to get the clients to say, okay, here's to separate out and be clear. Here's my emotional stake in this, but also here are the things that I want to see happen in the long run, and that in the end, one can be very angry or proud or whatever it would be, but you may still in the end want something that comes out of the mediation that will actually be livable by the both parties, and that in the end you won't be any happier if the mediation can't actually hold, and it can't actually get the parties to interact in some way that will last in the long run. And so that ability to try to get the clients to be able to say both things, okay, tell me all the things that you're feeling, and all the fears and goals and angers that are over here, but then also practically speaking, what would you like to come out of all this, and what would you not like to come out of all this? And in many mediations, I'm now thinking like of divorce mediations. In the end of the day, the thing has to work. It can't. It doesn't. That you. if there are children involved, they need something that will actually hold so that the parents can deal with the children. And so I think that maybe in at least some situations, one of the fighting examples that the stronger examples that I've seen that came from the mediation expertise, that desire to get the parties to recognize that they actually have a need to have a realistic assessment so that the outcome can hold, can actually work.
Do you have any pointers for diffusing some of the extreme emotions so that you can get to the more rational conversation? Because sometimes early in the morning, that client will come in and say, you ask me what I want. What do I want? I want them annihilated. I want them to suffer the way they've made me suffer, right?
Exactly.
So if you're confronted with that, Saul, what's effective?
Yeah, no, well, first of all, I should be once more very clear that this is an area where I'm not an expert. And so I'll be giving you the edges of ideas that I've seen that look relevant, to this. But I don't think I necessarily will know much more than or I probably know less than actually the people that we're speaking to. But let me try out one of the elements that I was noticing that I was struck by. There have been studies, and I think my impression is it was Claude Steele was one of the researchers who's trying out this, before a discussion began or a debate began of some sort, they would ask the parties to really express their values and express what it is that they cared about, what did they really feel was important to them, and what kind of person did they want to be? What kind of world did they want to live in? To really step back and ask, what is it that's meaningful, just as a placeholder before that you begin, and that having people have a chance to really get out what it is that they care about first, and then start the discussion and the negotiation, looked like it was actually having some very positive effects. I mean, among them, people didn't have to express their values by their positions in the debate, in the discussion. They already had expressed their values, and now they had more room to maneuver about the positions without it having to also be a demonstration of what they felt. And so I think that was rather interesting, and I don't know whether that would help in these kinds of situations.
I think it would. And what about, Saul, the whole issue of respecting people's attitudes toward risk? One person, you may say, you've done all the analysis correctly, you understand confidence levels and all the rest, and you say to the client, hypothetically a plaintiff, say, I can say with 70% confidence that if we win this case, your damages are going to be between $1 million and $1,500,000. And some people will say, oh, he believes that with 70% chance. Great, let's go for it. Other people will say, oh my God, he has only a 70% chance view of that. I'm kind of gun shy. What are some insights you might have as to how we deal with people's different attitudes toward risk, particularly when they may be more aggressive or more conservative than we ourselves are in our attitudes toward risk?
Yeah. No, I think that the once one has established what we think the facts of the story are, let's say including what the odds are of that something might win or not, then there's still a leftover question, and it needs to be brought up, which is the question of how do people value the different outcomes, and how they value the uncertainties. Are they willing to say, well, I'll go along with a coin toss, and if I have a half a chance of it coming out the way I want, I'll accept the fact that there's also a half a chance it just won't work. Whereas somebody else may really feel that they don't want to work under those conditions, and they would rather maybe settle in a different way. And I think that's a very legitimate thing for people to have differences. That's something that's personalities have different reactions to. Similarly, they may have different evaluations of the results. So for one it could be that if it comes out this way, they will feel it's great. Another one might feel like, well, it's fine, and so that weighs how much this particular outcome odds matter and what decision you might make. And so I think it's probably important to help people separate out. Okay, here's the factual issues, but here are the things that you as the client have to think through. What does it feel like to you? And will this be important? And will this not be important to you? What will it mean for your future life? Will you feel that afterwards that was what who you want to be or what you want to get from it? And those are things actually that are sometimes helpful for people to talk to other people about. It's not just the facts that are important, but it's also the values and and those are ones where people can actually learn something sometimes, where they realize that I was prioritizing this value, but in the end of the day, I realized that I was giving up this other value, and I have to actually choose between them. It's not a matter of whether I'm going to get this value or not. It's whether I want this value, despite the fact that it goes against some other value I have. So I think those are actually useful conversations to have, but it's helpful to have them be understood that that's a separate question, and that it's one where the lawyer can be helpful in just helping set the stage for it, but they won't have more expertise than the client does in terms of what is meaningful for the client.
Yes, most commonly we see that in talking about the costs of going forward with litigation, that to get the kind of result you want, it's going to cost you XYZ dollars in legal fees, and it's also going to take up approximately this many months or more likely years, and there's going to be emotional wear and tear on you during that period. I imagine go ahead. You look like you want to say something.
No, I've just been very aware of some cases I've seen that looked a little bit like the Jarvis versus Jarvis. Was that the literary example from one of the
Dickens novels? Yes.
Yeah, right. Where by the end there was nothing to fight over. There's no money left. After all the settlements. And it took maybe, I remember, years, maybe generations for it to happen. And I gather that that's not uncommon. I've certainly seen cases of that. And obviously that's the kind of thing that's very hard for people to understand.
Well, we often remind people of the quote generally attributed to Mark Twain: "I have been financially ruined but twice in my life. Once when I lost a lawsuit, and the second time when I won one."
Exactly.
So,
which I assume is actually one of the whole points of why people have started to develop mediation as an alternative, right?
Absolutely. So I want to go back to something that you've discussed at the very beginning, and then I want to share with you one insight that I got from the book. You talked about people finding patterns where there is no pattern. And many times we have the need to find agency in things that are actually random. And most of the time, people are not in conspiracies against us. It may be, I think it was maybe Churchill who said even paranoids have real enemies. But most of the time, people are not in conspiracy against us. What techniques are effective in trying to get through this often unwarranted inference of agency or conspiracy against us?
Often there are two ways that I think known ways that people fall into this, right? One is that, as we described before, that coincidences and just the odds, random events looking like a pattern are really hard not to be fooled by. And I think one of the ways that we've tried in the book and the course to get people to have a healthier understanding of this is just to experience a lot of cases where you generate randomness, and then you see, I would have believed the pattern there if I saw it. I mean, you flip a coin, 40 times or whatever it is, and you're shocked at how long the runs of heads or tails are, and you would have assumed that it was a weighted coin if you had seen that. But it's just how randomness works. And so the more experience one has with that, and scientists ended up forcing themselves to come across this over and over and over again. But everybody should try to do this enough so you start to realize that many, many things will look like patterns. And as you say, if it's about humans, it'll look like conspiracies. But just random events will have that happen because our brains home in on the ones that look like patterns, and we don't notice the thousands and millions of other ones that went on every day that we just didn't show a pattern that day. And so that's, I think, really a good story for people to get, and for them to have some to start practicing watching for things where they can see randomness and then see. I would have fallen for that if I had seen that, and I thought that and I would take that as a and if it was people, I would take it as a pattern of how they behave towards me. The other thing that is rather interesting is there's this, at least in the Western world, there's a tendency towards what is, I guess, was described as in the psychological literature as the fundamental attribution error, and that's to when somebody else does something wrong, that you assume that they intended it, and when you do something wrong, you assume that it was just a mistake, and that I gather in some other societies, people tend to be aware a little bit more of the systemic things that push people towards some behavior or others. And so that helps a little bit with respect to this. But for us, I think it's so easy for us to interpret other people's behaviors as intentional. And if they do something that hurts us in any way, we think that they did something to hurt us. Whereas we know that most of the time when we're out in the world, we just didn't notice that there's a pedestrian about to step into the crosswalk, and we went by and we think afterwards, oh, I should have stopped. I just didn't see them. They had to wait on the curb, an extra minute. That wasn't so bad. But of course, in these cases that I'm sure your clients would come across all the time, these things look terrible because you assume that you weren't trying to do anything wrong. You were just doing what everybody does, and so a few mistakes happened. Whereas if you're on the receiving end, you think, wow, that person, really was clearly, out to get me,
Yes. Let me I know we're over time by just a minute or two, Saul, but one way that I will sometimes introduce this in a mediation is to say, if you had a random coin and you flipped it 1 billion times, you might find 1 million consecutive heads or 1 million consecutive tails. But that doesn't mean that the coin is unfair. Then I'll ask people, can you think of other times in your life when you attributed a motive to someone and it turned out that that was incorrect? And once you can get people thinking that way, it's a little easier to ease into it. The other thing that I got directly from the book that I want to attribute to you is when we can get somebody to say that their chances of winning a case are not 99.9%, but let's say we get them down into the 80s. You can say, okay, so you say 83%. So there's a 17% chance you're going to lose this case. What would have to happen as the litigation proceeds to result in this case ending up in that 17% bucket? Well, the lawyer says, here's what would have to go wrong. The judge would have to rule X, the witness would have to testify Y, the jury would have to be full of people like thus and so. And then if I can break it down that way and get people then to say, okay, now what's the chance of the jury being filled with this or that kind of person? What's the chance of the witness not testifying a certain way? What's the chance of you're not being able to find the smoking gun document? The more that it can be atomized and people can give some realistic percentage of the things that, if those things happen, then we're more likely to lose the case, then that 87% or 83% starts to come down. And that is a technique I have used in mediations that I got directly from having read your wonderful book. I'm holding it up again because I hope people who view this will buy the book and read it. I got a lot out of it, and I hope a lot of other people will too. Third Millennium Thinking by Professors Perlmutter, Campbell, and McComb. Professor Saul Perlmutter from the University of California, Berkeley, this has been an absolutely fascinating and fantastic hour. Thank you so much. I hope that people are able to contribute to the food bank at Cal that provides for students with food insecurity. Also here in Los Angeles, we need their help for relief from the fires. And with that, we are complete.